Building a full stack app with Python. Number two,
Building an API.
building an API. Okay.
And last one, what's the difference between an API and a website stroke application in
Between
practical use case?
okay, an API and website slash app, web app. Okay. All right. So we'll talk about those use cases, and in fact, I think I'll just like answer the questions with mostly use cases. So, um, hmm, okay. So let's start with. I'm sure you understand some of these things already, right? You know, API for example, but I'm also going to like briefly. I'll just touch on them. API, websites, web app. Okay, so let's just take these three. So real quick, an API is simply an application that is meant to be accessed by another application, right? So not necessarily a human being interfacing with this. Developers interface with this, of course, but they basically use it for integration into other applications, right? So this is what I mean. If a developer is touching an API, it means they're trying to integrate it into maybe like a mobile application or a web application. So at the end of the day, what communicates with that API is another application. Okay. So an API is basically server. So let's call it server side. Sure, you must have heard of these terms before. So we have server side, and we also have client side. Okay, so that client side is where I will move the website into. So the client side, basically, it can have website, you have applications, mobile app, right, or web apps, of course. They are the applications that the users will use, right? So whether you call it a web app, you bring in a mobile app, they are all under apps, right? Apps in the sense that people are basically interacting, with these applications, right? People are interacting with these apps. Now, what's now the difference between a web app and a website? So take a look at something like Facebook, right? Facebook, you would call that an app. You have a lot of activities, actions. People perform actions on these platforms or on these pages, right? And there's a feedback, right? And you have actions like performing a like action, posting, right? Maybe updating your post, deleting a post, liking a post, right? So you have like a lot of actions happening there. Now take a look at a website. A website would be something that you're just building to basically have people see, right? Maybe your service, maybe your product. The moment you have activities happening there, so for example, like an e-commerce, we call it an e-commerce web app, right? If we say a site, more like a one page, two page, or three page, website that people can simply visit and see what you do. At the end of the day, you are basically looking at a page that is accessible from your browser, right? But the difference in the name only comes from how that particular page that you have opened operates, right? What can happen there. Okay, how do they use it? Do you understand? So that's just a major difference. That's why some people call a web app website. It's fine. They call, oh, go to, let's visit the Facebook website, let's visit a YouTube website. You are visiting a website because it's simply a site on the web. But when you now get to that site and you realize it's something you can basically interact with, you can perform actions, you get feedbacks, you can upload the video on YouTube, you can play that video. So you have a lot of things going on there, and it is worthy to be called an app. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does.
Okay. So at least with that out of the way, when we say API, right, application programming interface. Okay. I don't know why this is not. I have to stretch this manually. So let's stop here. Application programming interface. Now the idea is when you have a web app like Facebook, for example. Let's continue to work with this example. You have Facebook. Facebook has a client-side application. The client-side application is the one you access, on your browser, right? And They would also have the server side, right? So we can call that the Facebook API, right? So the server side is that API service one, two, three, or even 1,000 of them, right? Hosted somewhere on their servers, right, on machines that the client would basically communicate with, right, in order to be able to perform something. So let's look at REPL IT, or we are replit.com. So if I inspect on my browser and I go to network, so I'm simply going to clear everything I have here. I'm going to click on one of these actions here, maybe like run. When I click on run, I don't have anything on this page, right? But something happened. So let's take a look at what happened. We have some actions that were called. These are basically API actions. Let's look at the header. So you see this is an API. We have sp.repolit.com/v1/t, right? Although we don't really know the exact meaning, if this is what is running our application, I believe it should be what is running our application. Let me cancel this and run again. So you see the same set of calls, right? We also have like a GraphQL API that is being called with a post request, right? Let's look at the payload. Okay, so for the payload, I can't see anything in the payload. Every API request, should have what we call, you have an endpoint, right? So the endpoint is what you are calling. It can be api.marvelouswebsite.com. It can be, it can be marvelous. It can just be marvelouswebsite.com sitting as an API on its own, right? And I will show another example, like something more practical. But I just want to show you what we call a payload because we'll get to that section as well. So if I have something like print, okay, that's an assistant. I think I'm in the wrong place. So let me pull out this a bit. Okay, I hope you can still
So
hear
just
me.
select main.py beside console
Oh,
under the
nice.
run button.
I see a lot of things have
Then
changed here. So can I? Ah, this is what I used to know. Print hello world. Okay, okay, print hello world. So if I press run, let me clear this. Come back to network. Expand this a bit. Okay, so if I press run again, so now we have this same set of items. If I click on any of them, check on the payload. So now I can see some set of data, right? Um, so I think maybe this message I've typed in here was probably compressed or something. I can't see a GraphQL request going on right now, right? But I'm sure within one of these requests, uh, within one of these requests, we have this payload, sent somewhere, right, before compilation and all that. I also believe that they are using, web containers. But these are mostly web containers, and so you see, run button clicked. That's an event, right? And this was a post, request to the backend API, right, running on this port. Okay, so what am I trying to explain here? When you have an API hosted somewhere, is hosted on the server. That server, of course, has an IP, right? Or it has maybe like a domain name, right? So it can be api.solomonmarvel.com. It can be, a specific IP. Maybe if you don't have a domain name, right? You can host this on a machine, maybe on AWS. So let's just say API hosted on AWS EC2, right? And then you can have multiple applications, communicate with this. So you can have facebook.com, you can have mobile. I think they have m.facebook.com, that's their mobile version, right? And they can have even maybe their business.facebook.com. Now, ideally, they will probably have like multiple APIs serving different versions of this. But the point is, you can decide to use the same API service to serve multiple clients. That is just what I'm trying to say. You can use server-side programming languages to build those APIs. So, for example, you can use Python, or even Java or C Sharp. You can say we want to build an application for a to-do management app, right? And if you have an application use case like this where you have users and users, so users as the entity, should be able to create to-dos, right? To-dos or like this, okay? And the users should be able to retrieve the to-dos to do that they create. Okay, so what I'm just trying to say here is that we have users should be able to create, to-dos, and the user or the users should be able to create a specific to-do that that they've created. They should be able to fetch it, right? They should be able to retrieve it. Okay, so this is a task that you have been given, and you decide to say, oh, I want to build this with some front-end technology like Vue.js, right, or React, and on the back end, so this is what you will use to basically build your user facing app. And on the back end, I choose to use Python, right? That will be deployed on DigitalOcean, for example, right? And for my database, which is also server side, right? Clients don't interface directly with database, so I probably just want to use maybe Firebase or MongoDB. Okay, so what you are now going to do is to build an API that can perform the specific actions, that your um, requirements that your requirement has given here, right? That your requirement has here, right? Such as creating to do, retrieving to do. They did not mention we should delete to do, so we are assuming that we are not expected to do that. So we have create to do. This is an action. I'm just like trying to map this. Then I will show you how the API would basically serve this. So we have and retrieve, right? Retrieve. Okay. So using Python, you would look out for a framework, right? A web framework that can create APIs, right? And these web frameworks that are creating APIs can also create, the front end, which is the client side, right, of these applications. And that is where the full stack thing comes in that you mentioned, right? If you are trying to do full stack, it means you can also do templating, right? If you check PHP guys, for example, right? If they are using Laravel or I think there's one called Slim PHP, right? You should be able to build your server side while also using templating to give you your client side. So if somebody visits a particular page, right, a particular URL, you are able to render something on the HTML. Remember that you are visiting that URL from the browser, right? So it's called a GET request. And so when something is going from your browser, you're trying to fetch records from the backend, you're trying to fetch some information, it's a GET request. If you're trying to send to the backend, which is on the API, it's a POST request, and we'll talk about that soon. We call those things HTTP verbs, right? We'll talk about them very soon. Okay, so back to this, we have our actions. What we'll do is to simply use, since we're using Python here, we would use like Flask, right? Or Django. We have so many of them, Pyramid and the rest of them. Let's stick to Flask. We can use Flask to build our full stack app, or simply APIs if you want to do just APIs. If you are building a full stack app with Flask, it means you are introducing what I called earlier, templating, using, of course, we have different types of template engines. But for this example, I can just say Ginger 2, right? Which is good. If you're using JavaScript, you might have heard of things like handlebars, right? Handlebars, EJS, there are different types, POG, right? Or JavaScript. But this is Python, so let's talk about Ginger 2. Now, the way this will work, right? Since we're talking about full stack, remember initially I mentioned that you can use React on the front end, right? But just to mention how this would work if it's full stack and you're using Ginger 2, what you would do is that you would have your API. You would have your API with this endpoint. So the first one will be maybe a get request. So app.get, and let's call this the home. Let's just leave it like this. Okay. So what you will do, let me do it this way. Yeah. So df, I would say homepage. Okay. So I would simply render. Let me just say render home. So you would have a views you would have a views folder, where you can store all your HTML, which is in this case, a Ginger with a Ginger template. You will store all those things in a views, right? If you have heard of MVC, model view controller, the view will basically be an HTML file, something that would appear like this, HTML, and you basically HTML, and here you have your body with all the information here. So Ginger would basically allow you to pass parameters, right, like name. So parameters that you can basically send from the Python application. You pass that parameter into this render object and it would get here. So while rendering, Ginger would allow you put those values in the front end, right? If it's a to do, if it's objects, all those things, you will basically put them in here. So yeah, I just want to make sure you understand what I'm talking about. Now you have model view controller. This is the controller, right? In this MVC, you can check out MVC later. This is the controller. This is your view, which is HTML, right? And of course CSS. So you can also have your styling in here, or you can, abstract your styling away from this file. Then you have, the model. What is model basically? Of course, your database, right? So you have like def create to do, right? And let's just say pass now. Okay. So excuse me, my sister is asking me, are you sleeping? So let me say no, I am coming. Before they will assume I've slept and they will lock the door. Please, I'm very hungry. So all right. So this is MVC. Here you have your view, HTML. Here we have controller, and here we have our model. Okay, so now this is part of what you have built on your API. Remember, MVC that I'm speaking to is just a pattern, right? We have a lot of patterns, but this can actually explain what we're trying to do. You have your view, which is HTML, your controller, which is basically going to receive the request. So you have someone here who is, let's use you, John, right? So John is on this website and John wants to create a new to do. John is going to open a browser, right? So you're going to open a browser. And let's just say browser. So when you're on this browser, you basically go from the place you enter the URL and you just enter to do app.com. Okay, so when you enter to do app.com, remember this makes up our application, right? So our application at this point in time is a Flask application, Flask app that we have deployed on DigitalOcean, right? And maybe we use apps platform, which is DigitalOcean's PaaS, right? And this app is running on port 8080, for example, maybe using Docker or something. So you have this running on port 8080. When you run this, it's going to give you a URL. Our platform doesn't give an IP, but of course it's mapped to an IP. So let's just say the URL it's giving us is a single user. So when I mean single user, I'm referring to since you are the one hosting this application and you are not married, so single user dot digitalocean.com. So this is the URL they give you specifically. Okay, so yeah, when they give you this URL and you're trying to make this request, so you're visiting this page for the first time. Remember, you already mapped to do app.com to this particular application. Now mapping this is basically saying, oh, I have a default URL they gave me, but I want to put my own custom domain. You have the ability to do that. When you do that, they ask you to enter a CNAME record or an A record into the place where you purchase the domain name. So that should be clear to you, I believe. If you purchase your name from Namecheap or from Cloudflare, right, or WooGoHost, whichever platform you use, when you say, oh, this is my domain name and I want to use this instead of the one you gave me, they will tell you, okay, go ahead and enter this CNAME record in your DNS. Of course, you must have already configured what they call the name server, right? You already have this, maybe still using your default name server. So since it's still using your default name server, let's use Namecheap, right, as a base. What you now have to do is include this record in the DNS, right? So in the DNS, let's assume you're asked to include a CNAME record, right? So you put maybe the name as @ and there you have the CNAME where you need to point this to, right? You need to point that application to. So they will give you something, right? .digital.do.com, right? Whatever they give you, you put it there so that this domain name would be able to reach this. If somebody should type this on their browser, it will reach this. And since you're just typing this and it gets here, it means you are navigating to the base. This is the base in the controller where you have just slash, right? If you have slash hello, right, it means the person has to say todoapp.com/hello, right? If you have a slash fetch to do's, you have to go to todoapp.com/fetch to do's, which is also a get request. And I think that brings us, down to what I called HTTP verbs, right? HTTP verbs. Okay, so I believe you already know HTTP, hypertext transfer protocol. Okay, so it's basically a protocol that kind of like gives the rules as to how things are transferred, especially how hypertext, items, right, are transferred over the internet, right? And hypertext, such as text, right? You have, text and images and all that, right? Transferred over the web. Okay, so HTTP verbs, such as post, put, get, delete. Of course, we have patch, right? But let me just stop here. I'm just going to, give a brief explanation here. So, post, ideally, now you must understand something, right? You can actually use even post to create a record, delete a record, even get a record. But I mean, I won't say get a record, because except you are using the post from something like Postman, which is an API testing tool. If it's from your browser URL there is always going to send, a fetch, right, which is a get. Okay, but the thing is, any of them can actually, be interchanged, but it makes sense. It makes sense as a professional to, follow the rules, so that if another developer see post, they know what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so this is used to fetch items from your backend. Okay, from the backend, from your API, right? Put is used to, basically, I would say, update, right? Update records, DB. So you're basically sending that from, your client. The client can be Postman, it can be, your browser. But of course, you won't. If you want to send a put request, it has to come from your JavaScript code within your client application, not necessarily from the browser interface. Although you should be able to maneuver your way to, send requests, using the network bar there. You can resend some requests you've sent before, right? So I have update the records. Let's just say in your application, so that it doesn't look like you're sending it straight to your database. It has to get to your backend. Okay. Or it has to get to an intermediary that will then, make that update on your TB. All right. So get requests, which is fetching items or fetching records. Delete, of course, deleting records from your TB, and then patch. So patch is also used for updating, but mostly if you want to update some part of that record. So updating some part of the record in your TB. Okay. All right. If you want to learn more about this API stuff, you can check. What's it called? Open API and I think Smart Beer API course. I used to also organize API programs. Anyways, check their academy. There are some great materials there, and then check a tool like Stoplight Studio. I use Stoplight Studio for API design. Right? I've shown you this stuff before, so you can download the desktop app and use it for API design. Then if you open Postman, so we have some API clients such as Postman. We have HTTP, more modern tools, right? Although I still prefer Postman, right? So yeah, I think HTTP is also great. Let's go to the web app. Let's see. I think we should be able to use this from the web. Yeah. Okay. So these are some AI crazy stuff there. So yeah, if I try to use get, look at get here. If I go to a place like HTTP. I keep forgetting the name. API tests endpoints, um, online API testing tools. So these are basically, it's just showing me some like API testing tools, but there's a fake API. Okay, let's see, fake API JSON. Yeah, JSON placeholder. Okay, so if I call JSON placeholder, you see we have some mock endpoints such as getting posts, right? So if I just say slash posts, if I come here and I say I need to copy the entire URL. So let's copy this in the browser there, slash posts. It's going to give us all those posts, right? So what I'm doing now is I'm making a get request. Look at the verbs here. See, we have options, delete, patch, put, post, head, right? Of course, you can create custom, but yeah, we're basically making a get request, as you can see. That's be one slash. So we have headers, we have authorization if you want to set up, the auth body and all that. Then we also the auth payload. Sorry, if you want to set up body, body would most likely. So now you are seeing nobody, right? I go to post, and then I can click on this. Let's see. Oh, I can click on this and say I want to send a text. Okay, and my text should be a JSON, right? I can select different types here. If I go back to JSON placeholder, I can specify that under the post I want to create a post. So I have slash post, right? If I want to create a post, so I would simply say I'm already at slash post. So let's just put the object. I can also tell you how to specify this, but let me click on the posts, and I will simply create a new post by copying this, pasting it here just like this. Okay, so this is the preview of what I'm sending. I send this, I can update this to like let's change the body, Marv. So this is a to do. It is compulsory. Am I spelling compulsory to eat food this evening? Okay, so if I send this, we have a syntax error, right? So the syntax error here, let's take that off. Okay, so let's send again, and now you see we have this object. So you see Marv, it's compulsory to eat food this evening. Although this is not going to save on their end, it's just a test, but the point is it was successful, right? So that's how you make this set of requests. Okay, if I go back to our Xcali draw, so at least you understand now that by default your browser would send that request straight to your controller. So you have that request coming to your controller right here, and then your controller, if it has to fetch something from the database, would simply call your model, right? I usually prefer to call it like a repository instead of a model, right? I usually prefer to call a model something related to your business model, but people already call this model, which is also not a bad idea, but I prefer to call this repository, right? So I think the MVC pattern just make people assume that, oh, this is our model, everything that has to do with storing our data is model, but I call it repository, right, instead of or maybe like a data access layer or something, because this will then call your DB. So if you have your database here, let's say MongoDB, just like what we specified, then this would call your DB with some queries, get the response, and then the response would basically cascade back to your controller, and then your controller would show you the response on your HTML, which is your view. Okay, so I think you raised your hand. Please, if you want to ask your question, go ahead. You want to ask a question?
Okay, it was not a question, it was more like the whole model thing. I think I understand where it comes from because usually they refer to like when you're trying to do anything with the database, they always refer to it as the data model.
Yes. So I think it actually came from most. I don't think I would call this like data model. I don't think we used to call it data model in the past, right? When I started programming, doing VB, C sharp, we don't really call this model. At least while I was learning, it wasn't something I would call a model. So first we have what we call schema, right? Schema is basically used to describe the shape of objects you send back and forth your API. We have model. For example, JavaScript developers would call a MongoDB, or let's say a Mongoose schema. They will call a Mongo schema their model. I'm telling you, that's what you see right now, right? JavaScript devs call their Mongo schema a model. I won't do that, right? What will I call a model? Imagine having like an application you're building for a business, right? And the business says, oh, in order to create a to-do, only users that are up to 18 years old, right, should be able to create a to do. Only users in Africa, that are up to 18 years old. This is a business rule, right? And the business rule can be defined maybe in a class, right? So you can say business to do, yeah, as a class. And within this class, you can now maybe have a constructor when you're creating your to do. Give us the to do object and give us the user object, right? And then we have, come on, constructor where that's JavaScript. Div init and yeah, so def init. You have self something like this. Okay, so in here you now have like self dot to do equals to do self dot user self dot user equals user. Okay, so in here you now have something like df validates user, right? Or you can just say create to do, and the first thing you want to do something like this is to say self, let's say user equals self dot user, or let's say current user, and we can simply say if current user dot age, right? Or that's what Python guys do. I don't know. This is bad. Okay, so that's user. So you can say if the current user, you get the age, and you say if the age is not equal to, or is not greater than or equal to 18, right? Maybe you want to wrap this in an int, something like this. Just return you are not up to age to create a to do, right? So now we are basically setting a business rule in here. We are not even making a call to a database yet, right? Now we can now have that repository file. This is, of course, what I'm trying to refer as my business model. Some people would do this, inside the controller. I mean, come on, or they would call it an helper, a helper file. I prefer to call this my model. And then I have my repository. So my repository would then, have something like this. Come on, this is not page. Too much grammar. So repository. So here I can have df create to do. I have do. Okay. So in here, I would simply say else. I don't need to even say else since I already have this if guy here. No, I'm writing Python like. Okay, so I don't need to do this. I mean, if it's not up to age, we have already returned, right? We can also add the other, the other parameter that we have, which is to check, if the person is African or not. But next, I can simply say, create to do right here. I'll just pass in the to do that will pass, which is self dot to do, right? So self dot to do, just like this, right? And that will be the end. So here I can simply return to do created, right? If this was successful. So in here, all I just have to do is to call my database that I already configured somewhere. I'll say dot create, right? And pass to do. So this is more like my MongoDB. So let's call it MongoDB instance dot create to do. So this is my repository, and if I need to return this, I'll just say response equals this. I'll just say return this. So this is my repository. So imagine you have a controller which is /create to do. You make that post request from Postman. It goes to the controller. The controller basically calls the model. The model does all the checks, and at the end of the day, call the repository to perform that action. So if somebody say, "Oh, we are unable to save this record," you actually know where to debug and how best to debug your application. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So this is what I used to call a model. Even in my applications today, this is what I call a model. This is what I call a repository. Or I mean, I can simply call it a repository and do some mixing here. If I think the developers on the application are already calling this a model, then yeah, I can even just call it a model and put everything together. But it's better to have clear separation. This is my model, my business model. This is my repository, right? And then I have my schema, which is just maybe doing serialization and deserialization, trying to see the record coming in, if it's valid, if it's what we want, We allow it to go to the controller. If it's not what we want, we reject it by implementing middlewares here and there. So this is basically, what the flow would look like, right? You make that request from your client, it gets to the application, the backend, the controller communicates to the model. At the end of the day, if we need to present some records, we push that to the view and we simply return or render that view. Okay. Now, coming back here, what we are doing in that instance, if we are not using a client like, if we're not using a front end framework like Vue or React, that's a full stack application, right? If we are using a client, then it becomes an API, just an API, because you have to communicate, with another client, which is what you are going to deploy on maybe Vercel or some of these single page applications. You can even deploy a client, as a backend deployment. It's called server-side rendering, server-side rendered applications. Maybe you are deploying it on, AWS server-side, resources, right? You can actually deploy it on EC2 and serve it with a node, right? Yeah. So you build your API, deploy your API, and then deploy your front end separately. And the difference between an API and a website, I think I've answered that already, right? So a web app can actually be a full stack app that also contains the backend, right? So an API is simply a backend application that only performs, the operations. Like it has a link to those, core system actions, where you then have a client communicating with it, right, and sending those requests, back and forth. A website is simply page, right? A page that can, that has some information, right? Page that has some information, and if it becomes a web app, if it performs some actions, right? API actions, yeah, performs those API actions. It basically sends those requests to the backend application, and the backend application would respond. Backend application, meaning the API, would respond, and the response will be presented to you in the front end, right, which is that client. Okay, so this is just simple, right? Not doing anything, maybe mostly presentational and stuff. So yeah, that is what it is. That is what it is. We have a lot of diagrams here. I think this is so. I hope that answers your question. I need to run to the kitchen now to grab my kitchen.
Yeah, yeah,
All
yeah.
right.
It does. Thank you so much.
Okay, I wanted also to write like an example Flask application, but there's no time. This is 37 minutes. All right, so bye bye.
Okay,